Okay, I want to talk about drawer parts, but more specifically the anatomy of the drawers. Um, in essence, there's only four parts. There's a front, sidewalls, a back, and a bottom. But they're all going to be treated with specific characteristics and sensitivity to what they're doing. Easiest place to start would be the front. So, talking about the drawer front here, you'll notice that this is going to be thicker than the sidewalls and then the back. Ideally, the structure of the drawer, the strength, the shape, all of that is going to be driven by the rigidity and the consistent nature of the front. I say all this just because we want to make sure that the thickness that we make our drawer fronts is going to be relevant to the size of the overall drawer. This is a small drawer, not a tiny drawer, but a small drawer. If this is a much larger drawer, then this conversation expands a little bit to make this size a bit more critical. Long story short, we typically make the front of the drawer 3/4 of an inch thick. As you all know, that's kind of the industry standard for wood dimensions. Anything less than 3/4 of an inch is much more prone to cupping, twisting, bowing, any of that. And so if we can get this to be 3/4 of an inch, then we have the best chance of not having the drawer front impose its will onto other elements of the drawer that would otherwise shift or change at the whim or mercy of the front. So 3/4 inch here. Looking at the other parts, the sidewalls are kind of a different story. Obviously much thinner here, and we're seeing the top, obviously, of the drawer, but on the bottom, this is where the bearing surface is going to be for running in and out of a runner-kicker style of drawer and drawer fitting. So because of this, this is where all of the friction, the resistance, the pressure, it's all going to land right here. You would think that because of that, we would need to expand the thickness of this so that it's able to withstand that movement. And I think to a certain degree that's true. But I think most people tend to overestimate what thickness this needs to be. And so this looks to be about 1/4 of an inch, more or less, and for this size of drawer, I think that's totally appropriate. For me, there are two issues. Number one is the aesthetics of, as you open up this drawer and then you see the sidewalls here, the thicker this thing becomes, the less elegant or the more clunky this drawer starts to feel to me. And it's just not totally necessary. The thickness of this is, again, the bearing surface on the bottom of the sidewalls of the drawer. The other part for determining wall thickness is this piece here. You see where the bottom of the drawer is engaged. So the bottom needs to be channeled out into a groove, and this wall thickness needs to be thick enough to support having that bottom go in and engage on both sides as well as the front. Pardon me. So 1/4 inch is plenty of material to do that. If this was a small drawer that was going to take on a great deal of weight, or a larger drawer, same issues, I would want to either increase the overall dimension of the wall thickness, or you can easily glue on another block here to give a little bit more bearing surface for the bottom. And traditionally furniture makers would do that. They didn't use as much material for making the sidewalls to do that, and it just supports where they need it and not everywhere else. So this one's 1/4 of an inch. I think that's about right. Anything less than 3/16 of an inch starts to get real delicate, and so for a tiny drawer, maybe that's a good fit. But for this size drawer, I think this is the right choice. The back of the drawer, the back of the drawer, you can see here, same thickness. So I milled these three parts at the same time, and those have all become the same thickness. You'll notice, if you can pick up on this on the camera, the wall thickness here is slightly less than the back, and it didn't start off that way, but that happens in the fitting process, which I'll talk about in the next video. So whatever these things start with, we also need to account for the wall thickness being planed down or fitted into, or fit, pardon me, into the carcass. Again, our runner kicker style drawer. The last part of this conversation is going to be the drawer bottom. At the bottom, you can get away with some relatively thin material depending on what you make it up with. This is a solid wood bottom. If this was a man-made product, it would have a greater propensity to start to succumb to the weight of what's in the drawer. The thing that you'll know or recognize is that I have a notch that I've drawn out here. I'm going to use a screw to grab or be screwed into the back of the drawer itself, and that will hold the distance between the two ends of the bottom into the drawer, and so it really does lock the whole thing in. And if your drawer is just a little bit out of square, by fitting that drawer in accurately and clamping it down with that screw, it will hold it into square if you do run into some problems and need it for a little assistance. So anyway, that's what the back is. This is made out of solid wood, as I mentioned, and you'll notice from inside of the drawer, just want to see you can see that. There we go. You'll notice that the grain runs side to side, and that's very the traditional way to do it, regardless of if it's solid wood or a man-made product, possibly something that's been veneered. The reason being, if it's solid wood, that material needs room to expand and contract, and that's the whole reason about this thing sticking out of the back a bit. If this is solid wood, it's going to expand out of the back. It's going to draw back when the winter time comes around or the less humidity. So anyway, this is the right way to do it. If the grain direction were the opposite, especially if it's solid wood, all that expansion is going to compromise the strength of the sidewalls of the drawer, and it could expand so much, given the fit that you would want to have with getting that drawer bottom into the groove, that it could blow your drawer apart. Or if the drawer is in place inside your carcass, it could compromise the carcass joinery as well. So it's super critical that this is the way it goes. And if you are going to use something that's being veneered, this is still a nice view to see. Most of the time, this is what your client or the person that you're making this for is going to see is this view here. They won't look at the end of that board, or pardon me, the edge of the board, to see that it's solid wood or not. But this is just a nice nod to the tradition of the process of drawer making. Okay, so last comment about materials is going to be what materials lend themselves to drawer making, and this is an inexpensive option for getting this demonstration done. This is made out of alder. You can see from the grain, this is a flat sawn board, and as you know, flat sawn material are the ones that show the most movement, seasonal expansion and contraction. If this material were to be quarter sawn, we have far less material or movement in the material this way and a little bit more in the thickness. But there's so little of that thickness there, you really don't notice that movement. So whenever I'm making drawers, I try to use quarter sawn material whenever I can. Simple reason being is once this goes into a carcass, if this gets sent off to a client, I cannot afford to get a call back and saying, hey, this drawer, I mean, the piece is beautiful, but the drawers won't fit, they won't open. And that's a problem. And so doing all the fitting, we'll talk about making clearances or allowances for that. But quarter sawn material serves you the most amount of gain in avoiding any problems. Mahogany has always been my first choice for drawer sides and back, but I've found that I make a lot of work or pieces that are made of mahogany, and so a mahogany front would make sense. And so as the drawer is opened, seeing mahogany, and mahogany is just a little too much in that color palette. And so, so a nice alternative to this, making a lighter interior drawer. I've been leaning towards using Sycamore, Cortison Sycamore lately, and harder to find, but dimensionally very, very stable, and it's a beautiful wood to see, and it's kind of a nice surprise to open the drawer and kind of get that experience. So, pardon me. Okay, let's talk about the joinery. The joinery for this is a little bit interesting in that, great, this is not like a traditional dovetail structure. We have a traditional thing in the front where we have a half pin up top, a half pin down below, and two tails. That's all stuff that I think you've seen and you know. The thing that is unique about drawers is that it cannot be symmetrical front to back. It can't be. And so if you're looking at a dovetail box like this, let me see if I can get in here. This is going to be well worth your time. Okay, so traditional dovetail boxes or joinery would, just like we talked about in the drawer, we have a half pin up top. What you can't see down here is a half pin as well, but because the lid is separating, we have termination here at half pin, and then tails everywhere between and pins. So this is kind of how this tail is held into place, as we have the two half pins kind of holding and capturing it in place. And traditionally that makes sense. We would never see a half tail end somewhere at the top, mostly because of the top view here. We have the shoulder here that continues on this line. If we had the tail coming off here, it would start to throw off the sequence of things. So anyway, very different joinery from a symmetrical dovetail box, and it has to be that way. Let me zoom out here, guys. No, still too close. There we go. Okay. So in this conversation, let's say that's better. Is that better or worse? That seems to be much worse. Okay. So you can see that the back is very different from the front, as I keep saying, and it's exactly the reason I said what you would not want to see if these were exposed dovetails. We have a full pin here, full pin, but then we have a half tail top and bottom, which is very curious. It's also very different front to back. So the front makes sense. We're doing a half blind structure here in the front. The back is the part that's interesting because I'm looking at the back of the drawer and the way this thing functions. We need to have clearance on this back edge on the top. It needs to be slightly recessed from that of the side walls. If these were on the same plane, if you can envision that this thing is sliding in and out of the carcass, if this was on the same plane all the way across, it would be dragging on. It would be dragging this way, actually, on the interior of the carcass. And if there's any shape that is less than 100% flat all the way across, it's going to start to create a lot of resistance. So you have potentially some resistance on the side walls and then on the back, and this thing is virtually impossible to function well. So we create a little bit of a gap here, and so we need to undercut this piece, and that's why you can see that the pin is lower here, and traditionally you'd see it up top. If we did it up top, there's no way we can carve out this section here, which we again need to have. The other reason that this is important is that this creates an escape route for the air inside of the carcass to come inside the drawer and then escape out the front. As you're closing, as you're opening the drawer, it will then suck in air into the carcass, or I'm sorry, the cavity of the drawer back into the carcass. So we need to have this for air to escape, and it's one of the best compliments I ever got was I was in an exhibition and somebody was checking out this chest of drawers that I built, and they were kind of floored because as they were opening and closing these drawers, he can feel the air pressure kind of hitting his face as he was closing it, and as he was opening up the drawers, he can feel that there was air being drawn into this environment. And he made some comments about never seeing a piece of furniture that's hermetically sealed, something to that effect. And I think he meant it somewhat pejoratively, but I took it as a compliment because I wanted all of my joinery to be tight. I wanted the fit of the drawers to work in a way that that got people talking. So anyway, so this one has got to be dropped a little bit down. Now the bottom is a different conversation because we're going to slide the bottom of the drawer in this way, as we talked about a second ago. So there's always going to be a gap here, which is great, and that won't drag inside the carcass. It will also allow air to escape. So this one is an obvious choice that it has to be there. Don't get fooled by the fact that we're going to get caught up in traditional joinery back here. Even though we're using the same joints, the layout is very, very different. So gap top, gap bottom. When we're looking at what exists in this environment, we also have this half-blind situation here in the front. Let me see if I can pull in tighter. There we go. So try my best to focus. There we go. Hopefully that's better. That feels much worse. Oh no, there we go. Okay. So in the front of the traditional dovetail drawer, we have a half-blind dovetail here. Again, very different from the through dovetails we have in the back. This section is referred to as a web. I've heard it called other things, but the web kind of makes sense. We need to have some material here coming off of the drawer front that will not allow that joinery to be exposed. I've seen plenty of pieces of furniture where these dovetails were extended and they would come out and you would see from the front the end grain of that piece. I just think it makes the piece look a little bit busier than it really needs to be. There's definitely a trade-off. The longer this angle is here when cutting your dovetails, creates more glue surface on these little cheeks. That's the only area that we'll be able to glue. But it also gives more mechanical advantage because that angle, there, and there, that will make it stronger because you have more of that structure. This drawer is going to be plenty strong. If you have well-fitting joinery, there's no compromise of strength by introducing this web. We also kind of lock in the geometry of these angles by having this web. When this side is fit in, it's captured on top, bottom, and then the front. And so that level of capture, again with well-fitting parts, creates an incredibly strong surface area and joinery connection situation for this thing to work. And so we do that. And again, the web is somewhat in debate. So ideally, we want to make this angle of the tails as long as we possibly can, which means we're going to compromise how much material we can leave in that web environment, which makes it very fragile. So if this is really thin, as we're fitting it, or even when we're chopping out that material, it could be vulnerable to breaking off and being compromised that way, which is a very sinking feeling. So we want to make this thick enough to be stable, but not compromise the strength of this tail. It's a long way around saying there's always going to be a trade-off and it's kind of a sweet spot for every design. I think a lot of it has to do with the overall dimensions of your drawers. This one is, it's about 1/8 of an inch, which I think is appropriate for this size of drawer. I've always heard this one recommended to the web to be considered somewhere in the neighborhood of 3/16 of an inch, and if I remember correctly, that's like 3 millimeters. And so So that material will be enough to give us the support we need once this is closed. But when part of the fitting of the drawer, when it goes into the carcass,